Last month, DC Comics announced that in early 2017, Warren Ellis, one of the biggest superstar writers in all of the comics industry, would be relaunching their Wildstorm titles and characters. That would start with a brand new book called The Wildstorm in early 2017. This was incredibly exciting to me because I was a huge Wildstorm comics fan back in the 90s. In fact, when I first moved into this house and I was trying to bring back all of my comics from all the places I had stored them, I found that I was missing one box, and it was a box of Image comics. It was driving me crazy, like, where could it be? Finally, my mom said, you know, I do have one more box of your comics in my closet that I've been moving around with me for the past 15 years. I was like, oh my gosh, are they the Image comics, or are they safe? And, you know, bless her, she did keep them safe, and so I got the box back and found some comics like this one, WildC.A.T.s 1 from 1992 by Jim Lee. And it immediately brought back memories of Jim Lee's awesome art, but also of this whole Daemonite versus Cherubim battle. But I also pulled a lot of other comics out of that box. Gen 13, which was a huge, huge influence on me at the time and one of my favorite comic books. And Stormwatch, which I had a few issues of, but I'd never really read. And that was the other half of Wildstorm, right? It was WildC.A.T.s and Stormwatch was Wildstorm. And I don't even know if I cracked an issue of Stormwatch. I probably was just buying them because there was such a delay on WildC.A.T.s that if there's some other Wildstorm title at the store, I would just pick it up, right? So I was going through this long box and discovering I had tons of gaps, and there was no way for me to read these stories. And unlike X-Men, because Wildstorm had changed hands with publishers, but also because it's just not that enduring in popularity, there's no long line of collected editions for Wildstorm books the way that there are for Marvel books. So I decided, well, I can do something about that. I can get all the books myself and then read them and get them put into bound editions. So that's what I decided to do, and this announcement of the DC Wildstorm initiative for 2017 actually came as I was picking up the last few books that I needed for my Wildstorm comprehensive reread. So cool! So actually, I want to take you a little tour of all the long boxes where I've got all of the Wildstorm comics. Here we are in the attic of Crisis, and it is a crisis in more than one way because, oh my gosh, if you saw the amount of comics that are just off frame here, you would probably be delighted, but it's terrifying for my attic. And I say this is almost the complete Wildstorm because it doesn't include Gen 13. I actually have all of those comics, but they're boxed separately just because there was no point in intermingling them with all the shorter series. So we start here with A. Here's Authority, A to Z, and also a number of anthology series like Wildstorm here. Now for me, Wildstorm was everything from the launch in 1992 with the beginning of WildC.A.T.s. Here's WildC.A.T.s 25 from that series, to 2006 when DC rebooted Wildstorm after the Armageddon event. So with the news of the Wildstorm relaunch and with that huge row of comics, I decided why not just reread some of the earliest Wildstorm for November so I could remember what it was all about, and in some cases find out for the first time, as with Stormwatch, which it turns out I freaking love and I'd never read before. So that's become a daily set of content at Crushing Crisis. I'm getting all the way through the launch of Wildstorm with WildC.A.T.s 1 from 1992 through Wildstorm's first big crossover, Wildstorm Rising. And so I guess in summary, the Wildstorm universe was like about two forces, right? There was the force of power and technology that was already on Earth and that had found its peak with Stormwatch, which had this weather station in space that was watching over the whole world and kind of just deploying their superpower teams wherever they were needed to put down any kind of resistance or global conflict because it was part of the UN. But then there was this secret undercurrent of incursions into our world. I'm sorry, I read Marvel, so incursions is part of my vocabulary now. Incursions into the world from other dimensions by other races. So WildC.A.T.s kind of, even though it was the signature title, focused on like an undercurrent of these Daemonites who could inhabit people's bodies, possess them, and then use them. In the opening series, Dan Quayle was one of the people that they had possessed. And that this was running underneath. It was not a thing like mutants that everybody knew about. In fact, even the people in the UN and Stormwatch didn't necessarily know about them. The Daemonites catch them by surprise in the second Stormwatch story, right? So these two things are happening at the same time, and then in Stormwatch, there's people from other dimensions just like popping in and wrecking stuff in our dimension, which then spins off into other books like Union, where somebody who's kind of a Superman figure comes from a dimension where he's just like a normal warrior, but here he's one of the most powerful beings on Earth, and it becomes Stormwatch's job to keep tabs on him because he's a potential threat. So I'm only about a year into my reading right now, and I'm really excited to get farther because I actually think a lot of these stories are good. You know, they get written off because they have this extreme art and because they were late and because sometimes the actual scripting was choppy, but Jim Lee and Brandon Choi had an amazing universe in their heads, and it kind of makes me sad that we're starting from scratch again, because I think there was so much good content back then. But at the same time, if anybody was going to start from scratch, it should be Warren Ellis. I mean, could you possibly pick anybody else? Especially since Ellis was such a huge influence on Wildstorm itself. It was one of the books that he wrote when he came into his huge popularity. WildC.A.T.s was one of them, as was Stormwatch, as it turned into The Authority. Of course, before that, he was writing my favorite comic book of all time, Excalibur, for Marvel. So that's a little glimpse of Wildstorm and my collection of Wildstorm, and I hope you're going to be tuning in at crushingcrisis.com to read along with me as I cover those first few years of Wildstorm comic books.